खबरां दा लेखा जोखा विच आप सब दा स्वागत है।
Khabran Da Lekha Jokha, November 6, 2024 has been sponsored by Hanif Litigation. Any criminal or regulatory law matters, contact lawyer Shahid Hanif at 604-626-3144. Hanif Litigation. Donald Trump, who has sweeping plans for a second administration. Here's what he's proposed. Donald Trump has promised sweeping action in a second administration. The former president and now president-elect often skipped over details, but through more than a year of policy pronouncements and written statements outlined a wide-ranging agenda that blends traditional conservative approaches to taxes, regulation, and cultural issues with a more populist bent on trade and a shift in America's international role. Trump's agenda also would scale back federal government efforts on civil rights and expand presidential powers. Built a look at what Trump has proposed on immigration. Build the wall. From his 2016 campaign has become creating the largest mass deportation program in history. Trump has called for using the National Guard and empowering domestic police force in the effort. Still, Trump has been scant on details of what the program would look like and how he would ensure that it targeted only people in the U.S. illegally. He's pitched ideological screening for would-be entrants, ending birthright citizenship, which almost certainly would require constitutional change, and said he'd reinstitute first-term policies such as remain in Mexico, limiting migrants on public health grounds, and severely limiting or banning entrants from certain majority Muslim nations. Altogether, the approach would not just crack down on illegal immigration, but curtail immigration overall. Abortion. Trump laid down abortion as a second-term priority, even as he looked credit for the Supreme Court ending a woman's federal right to terminate a pregnancy and returning abortion regulations to state governments. At Trump's insistence, the GOP platform, for the first time in decades, did not call for a national ban on abortion. Trump maintains this overturning Roe vs. Wade is enough on the federal level. Still, Trump has not said explicitly that he would veto national abortion restrictions if they reached his desk. And in an example of how the conservative movement might proceed without Trump, anti-abortion activists note that the GOP platform still asserts that a fetus should have due process protections under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. That constitutional argument is a roadmap for conservatives to seek a national abortion ban through federal courts. Texas. Trump's tax policies broadly tilt toward corporations and wealthier Americans. That's mostly due to his promise to extend his 2017 tax overhaul with the new notable changes that include lowering the corporate income tax rate to 15% from the current 21%. That also involves rolling back Democratic President Joe Biden's income tax hikes on the wealthiest Americans and scraping Inflation Reduction Act levies that finance energy measures intended to combat climate change. Those policies notwithstanding, Trump has put more emphasis on new proposals aimed at working and middle-class Americans, exempting earned tips, Social Security wages, and overtime wages from income taxes. It's noteworthy, however, his proposals on tips, depending on how Congress might write it, could give a backdoor tax break to top wages earners by allowing them to reclassify some of their pay as tip income, a prospect that at the most extreme could see hedge fund managers or top flight attorneys taking advantage of a policy that Trump frames as being designed for restaurant servers, bartenders, and other service workers. Tariffs and trade. Trump's posture on international trade is to distrust world markets as harmful to American interests. He proposes tariffs at 10% to 20% on foreign goods, and in some speeches has mentioned even higher percentages. He promises to institute an August 2020 executive order requiring that the Food and Drug Administration buy essential medications only from U.S. companies. He pledges to block purchases of any vital infrastructure in the U.S. by Chinese buyers. DI, LGBTQ and civil rights. Trump has called for rolling back societal emphasis on diversity and for legal protections for LGBTQ citizens. Trump has called for ending diversity, equity and inclusion programs in government institutions using federal funding as leverage. On transgender rights, Trump promises generally to end boys and girls sports, a practice he insists without evidence is widespread. But his policies go well beyond standard applause lines from his rally speeches. Among other ideas, Trump would roll back the Biden administration policy of extending Title IX civil rights protection to transgender students, and he would ask Congress to require that only two genders can be recognized at birth. Regulation, federal bureaucracy, and presidential power. The president-elect seeks to reduce the role of federal bureaucrats and regulations across economic sectors. Trump frames all regulatory cuts as an economic magic wand. He pledges precipitous drops in the U.S. households' utility bills by removing obstacles to fossil fuel production, including opening all federal lands for exploration, even though U.S. energy production is already at record highs. Trump promises to unleash housing construction by cutting regulations through most construction rules come from state and local government. He also says he would end frivolous litigation from the environmental extremists. The approach would in many ways strengthen executive branch influence. That power would come more directly from the White House. He would make it easier to fire federal workers by classifying thousands of them as being outside civil service protections. That could weaken the government's power to enforce salutes and rules by reducing the number of employees engaging in the work and potentially impose a chilling effect on those who remain. Trump also claims that presidents have exclusive power to control federal spending even after Congress has appropriated money. Trump argues that lawmakers' budget actions set a ceiling on spending but not a floor, meaning the president's constitutional duty to faithfully execute the laws includes discretion on whether to spend the money. This interpretation could set up a court battle with Congress. As a candidate, he also suggested that the Federal Reserve, an independently entity that sets interest rates, should be subject to more presidential power. Though he has not offered details, any such move would represent momentous change to how the U.S. economic and monetary system works. Education. The Federal Department of Education would be targeted for elimination in a second Trump administration. That does not mean that Trump wants Washington out of the classrooms. He still proposes, among other maneuvers, using federal funding as leverage to pressure kindergarten to 12 school system to abolish tenure and adopt merit pay for teachers and to scrap diversity programs at all levels of education. He calls for pulling federal funding for any school or program pushing critical race theory, gender ideology, or other inappropriate racial, sexual, or political content on our children. In higher education, Trump proposes taking over accreditation processing of colleges, a move he describes as a secret weapon against the Marxist maniacs and lunatics. He says control higher education. Trump takes aim at higher education endowments, saying he will collect billions and billions of dollars from schools via taxing, fining, and selling accessibly large private university endowments at schools that do not comply with his edicts that almost certainly would end up in a protracted legal fights. As in other policy areas, Trump isn't actually proposing limiting federal power in higher education, but strengthening it. He calls for redirecting the confiscated endowment money into an online American academy, offering college credentials to all Americans without tuition charges. It will be strictly non-political and there will be no wokeness or jihadism allowed. None of that's going to be allowed, Trump said on November 1st of 2023. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Trump insists he would protect Social Security and Medicare, popular programs geared toward older Americans and among the biggest pieces of the federal spending pie each year. There are questions about how his proposals not to tax tip and overtime wages might affect Social Security and Medicare. If such plans eventually involved only income taxes, the entitlement programs would not be affected. But exempting those wages from payroll taxes would reduce the funding stream for Social Security and Medicare outlays. Trump has talked little about Medicaid, but his first administration in general defaulted to approving state requests for waivers of various federal rules and a broadly endorsed state-level work requirements for recipients. Affordable Care Act and Health Care. As he has since 2015, Trump calls for repealing the Affordable Care Act and its subsidized health insurance marketplaces, but he still has not proposed a replacement. In a September debate, he insisted he had the concepts of a plan in the later stages of the campaign. Trump played up his alliance with former presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a longtime critic of vaccines and of pesticides used in U.S. agriculture. Trump repeatedly told rally crowds that he would put Kennedy in charge of making America healthy again. Climate and energy. Trump, who claims falsely that climate change is a hoax, blasts Biden-era spending on cleaner energy designed to reduce U.S. reliance on fossil fuels. He proposes an energy policy and transportation infrastructure spending anchored to fossil fuels, roads, bridges, combustion engine vehicles. Drill, baby, drill was a regular chant at Trump rallies. Trump says he does not oppose electric vehicles but promises to end all Biden incentives to encourage EV market development. Trump also pledges to roll back Biden-era fuel efficiency standards. Americans. Trump and Vice President-elect J.D. Vance framed their ticket as favoring America's workers. But Trump could make it harder for workers to unionize. In discussing auto workers, Trump focused almost exclusively on Biden's push towards electric vehicles. When he mentioned unions, it was often to lump the union bosses and CEOs together as complicit in this deleterious electric car scheme. In an October 23, 2023 statement, Trump said of United Auto Workers, "I'm telling you, you shouldn't pay those dues." National defense and America's role in the world. Trump's rhetoric and policy approach in world affairs is more isolationist, diplomatically non-interventionist, military and protectionist economically than the US has been since World War II. But the details are more complicated. He pledges expansion of the military, promises to protect Pentagon spending from austerity efforts, and proposes a new missile defense shield, an old idea from the Reagan era during the Cold War. Trump insists he can end Russia's war in Ukraine and the Israel-Hamas war without explaining how. Trump summarizes his approach through another Reagan phrase, peace through strength. But he remains critical of NATO and top U.S. military brass. "I don't consider them leaders," Trump said of a Pentagon officials that Americans see on television. He repeatedly praised authoritarians like Hungary's Viktor Orban and Russia's Vladimir Putin.
ਗੁਆਂਢੀ ਮੁਲਕ ਅਮਰੀਕਾ ਦੇ ਨੇ ਆਪਣਾ ਨਵਾਂ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਰਾਸ਼ਟਰਪਤੀ ਦੀ ਚੋਣ ਕਰ ਲਈ ਹੈ। ਡੋਨਲਡ ਟਰੰਪ ਹੋਰੇ ਨਵੇਂ ਰਾਸ਼ਟਰਪਤੀ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਨੇ 47ਵੇਂ ਹੋਣਗੇ, ਪਰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਰਾਸ਼ਟਰਪਤੀ ਦੇ ਵਾਂਗਡੋਰ ਸੰਭਾਲਣ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਕਿਹੜੇ-ਕਿਹੜੇ ਖੇਤਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਿਹੜੇ-ਕਿਹੜੇ ਇਫੈਕਟਸ ਆ ਸਕਦੇ ਆ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਵੇਰਵੇ ਚਰਚਾ ਦਾ ਵਿਸ਼ਾ ਬਣੇ ਹੋਏ ਨੇ, ਜਿਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਦੇ ਪ੍ਰਗਟਾਏ ਹੋਏ ਖਿਆਲ ਤੇ ਇੱਕ ਤੋਂ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਵਾਲੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਟਰਮ ਹੈ ਉਸ ਤੋਂ ਉਪਰੰਤ ਦੂਸਰੀ ਟਰਮ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਪਹਿਲੀ ਟਰਮ ਵਾਲੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਵਾਅਦੇ ਨੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਪੂਰੀ ਕਰਨ ਦੀ ਵੀ ਗੱਲ ਹੈ। ਇਮੀਗ੍ਰੇਸ਼ਨ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਵੱਡੇ ਪੱਧਰ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਹੈ, ਪਰ ਉਸ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਘਰੇਲੂ ਪੱਖ ਤੋਂ ਅਮਰੀਕਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਰਹਿੰਦੇ ਹੋਏ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਸੇਵਾਵਾਂ, ਸਿਹਤ ਸੇਵਾਵਾਂ, ਆਰਥਿਕਤਾ ਨੂੰ ਹੁਲਾਰੇ ਦੀ ਆਸ ਹੈ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਸਾਰੇ ਅਮਰੀਕਨਸ ਨੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਰਾਸ਼ਟਰਪਤੀ ਡੋਨਲਡ ਟਰੰਪ ਤੋਂ ਕਰਦੇ ਹੈ। ਉਸ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਅੰਤਰਰਾਸ਼ਟਰੀ ਪੱਧਰ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਗੱਲ ਚੱਲਦੀ ਹੈ, ਘਰੇਲੂ ਸਭ ਮਸਲੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਨੇ ਇਕਨੋਮੀ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਜੁੜੇ ਹੋਏ ਨੇ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਆਪਣਾ ਅਮਰੀਕਾ ਦਾ ਸਥਾਨ ਅੰਤਰਰਾਸ਼ਟਰੀ ਪੱਧਰ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਬਹਾਲ ਤੇ ਬਿਹਤਰ ਕਰਨ ਦੀ ਵੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਹੀ ਹੈ। ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾਤਰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀਆਂ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਪਾਲਿਸੀਜ਼ ਨੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਵੱਡੀ ਪੱਧਰ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਅਮਰੀਕਨ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਦੇ ਹਿੱਤ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਭੁਗਤਣ ਦੇ ਹਿੱਤ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਨੇ।
BC's new cabinet to be sworn in November 18. In just a couple of weeks, BC's new cabinet will be sworn in. Premier David Eby says the swearing-in ceremony will take place on November 18th after the judicial recounts in Kelowna City, Surrey Guildford and Prince George Mackenzie have been completed. Judicial recounts will ensure every vote is counted, Eby said on Wednesday. Following those counts, British Columbians want to see urgent action taken on their priorities, including affordability and housing, strengthening healthcare, and building strong communities within a vibrant economy. The first step is swearing in a new cabinet for British Columbians. The Premier's office explains that until the 18th, EB's transition team will be making recommendations to the Premier about the forming of ministries and the selection of cabinet ministers. The transition team is co-chaired by Doug White, the Premier's special counsel on Indigenous reconciliation, and Shannon Salter, the Premier's deputy minister and head of the public service, the Premier's office explained. The office adds that all newly elected MLAs will take their seats in the legislature prior to the cabinet swearing in, with MLAs to be sworn in on November 12th and 13th.
BC ਸੂਬਾ ਸਰਕਾਰ ਦੀ ਨਵੀਂ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਸਰਕਾਰ ਦੀ ਕੈਬਨਿਟ ਆ ਉਹ 18 ਨਵੰਬਰ ਨੂੰ ਘੋਸ਼ਿਤ ਹੋਏਗੀ, ਔਰ ਉਸ ਤੋਂ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਚੁਣੇ ਹੋਏ ਜਿਹੜੇ MLAs ਨੇ ਉਹ 12 ਤੇ 13 ਨਵੰਬਰ ਨੂੰ ਆਪਣਾ ਸਹੁੰ ਚੁੱਕ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਸਮਾਰੋਹ ਹੈ ਉਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸ਼ਾਮਲ ਹੋਣਗੇ। ਔਰ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਇਹ ਵੀ ਖੁਲਾਸਾ ਕੀਤਾ ਗਿਆ ਕਿ ਨਵੀਂ ਚੁਣੇ ਹੋਏ ਜਿਹੜੇ MLAs ਨੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਨਵੀਆਂ ਮਿਨਿਸਟਰਸ ਬਾਰੇ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਸੁਜੈਸ਼ਨਸ ਨੇ ਉਹ ਵੀ ਆਪਣੇ ਚੁਣੇ ਹੋਏ ਤੇ ਸਾਬਕਾ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਮੈਂਬਰਸ ਨੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਤੋਂ ਲਈਆਂ ਜਾਣਗੀਆਂ।
Donald Trump's victory sparks concern over ripple effect on Canadian economy. As Canadians wake up to the news that Donald Trump will return to the White House, the president-elect's protectionist stance in casting a spotlight on what effects his second term will have on Canada-US economic ties. Some Canadian business leaders have expressed worry over Trump's promise to introduce a universal 10% tariff on all American imports. A Canadian Chamber of Commerce reports released last month suggested those tariffs would shrink the Canadian economy, resulting in around $30 billion per year in economic cost. More than 77% of Canadians exports go to the US. Canada's manufacturing sector faces the biggest risk should Trump push forward on imposing broad tariffs, said Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters President and CEO Dennis Darby. He said the sector is the most trade exposed within Canada. It's in the US' best interest, it's in our best interest, but most importantly for consumers across North America, that we are able to trade goods, material, ingredients as we have under the trade agreements, Darby said in an interview. It's a more complex or complicated outcome than it would have been with the Democrats. But we've had to deal with this before, and we are going to do our best to deal with it again. American economists have also warned Trump's plan could cause inflation and possibly a recession, which could have ripple effects in Canada. It's consumers who will ultimately feel the burden of any inflationary effect caused by broad tariffs, said Darby. A tariff tends to raise raw costs and it is ultimately raises prices, so that's something that we have to be prepared for, he said. It could tilt production mandates. A tariff makes goods more expensive, but on the same token, it also will make inputs for the US more expensive. There was a total of more than $960.9 billion in the trade between Canada and the US in 2022, accounting for close to two-thirds of the more than $1.5 trillion in worldwide trade that year, according to Statistics Canada. A report last month by TD economist Mark Irocolao said research shows a full-scale implementation of Trump's tariff plan could lead to a near 5% reduction in Canada export volumes to the US by early 2027, relative to current baseline forecasts. Retaliation by Canada would also increase cost for domestic producers and push import volumes lower in the process. Slowing import activity mitigates some of the negative net trade impact on total GDP enough to avoid a technical recession, but still produces a period extended stagnation through 2025 and 2026. But he said there is hope that Canada could avoid the worst-case scenario based on lessons learned from Trump's first term, when he frequently threatened tariffs on Canada that didn't materialize and those that did were more targeted than feared. Ercolao said the 25% tariff on steel and 10% levy on Canadian aluminium imports imposed in 2018 had localized industry impacts but only modest macro effects. Since the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement came into effect in 2020, trade between Canada and the US has surged 46% according to the Toronto Region Board of Trade. With that deal up for the review in 2026, Canadian Chamber of Commerce President and CEO Candace Lang said the Canadian government must collaborate effectively with Trump administration to preserve and strengthen our bilateral economic partnership. The Chamber report last month noted many provinces rely on trade with the U.S. to fuel their economies. In New Brunswick, U.S. trade accounts for 62% of the provincial economy, followed by Manitoba and Alberta at 42%, Ontario at 41%, and Quebec at 23%. It said several U.S. state economies are also surprisingly dependent on Canadian trade, led by Montana, where trade with Canada accounts for 16% of the state economy, followed by Michigan at 14% and Illinois at 10%. With an impressive $3.6 billion in daily trade, Canada and the United States are each other's closest international partners. The secure and efficient flow of all goods and people across our border remains essential for the economies of both countries, Lang said in a statement. By resisting tariffs and trade barriers that will only raise prices and hurt consumers in both countries, Canada and the United States can strengthen resilient cross-border supply chains that enhance our shared economic security.
ਅਮਰੀਕਾ ਦੇ ਨਵੇਂ ਚੁਣੇ ਰਾਸ਼ਟਰਪਤੀ ਡੋਨਲਡ ਟਰੰਪ ਦੀ ਐਡਮਿਨਿਸਟ੍ਰੇਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਵਾਂਗਡੋਰ ਸੰਭਾਲਣ ਦਾ ਕਿਸ ਪ੍ਰਕਾਰ ਕੈਨੇਡੀਅਨ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਜਾਂ ਕੈਨੇਡੀਅਨ ਵਿਵਸਥਾ ਉੱਤੇ ਅਸਰ ਪੈ ਸਕਦਾ ਹੈ, ਇਸ ਦੇ ਚਰਚੇ ਹੁਣੇ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਹੋ ਗਏ ਨੇ। ਯਾਦ ਰਹੇ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਪ੍ਰਬੰਧਕਾਂ ਦਾ ਇਹ ਵੀ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਕਿ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਸਾਡੇ ਪਾਸ ਤਜਰਬਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਟਰੰਪ ਐਡਮਿਨਿਸਟ੍ਰੇਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਡੀਲ ਕਰਨ ਦਾ, ਸੋ ਕੋਈ ਬਹੁਤੀ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਮੁਸ਼ਕਿਲ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੋਏਗੀ। ਪਰ ਡੋਨਲਡ ਟਰੰਪ ਹੋਰਾਂ ਨੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਚੋਣ ਵਾਅਦਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਪਸ਼ਟ ਕੀਤਾ ਹੋਇਆ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਹੀ ਕਿ ਉਹ ਅੰਤਰਰਾਸ਼ਟਰੀ ਪੱਧਰ 'ਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਮੁਲਕ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਉਣ ਵਾਲੀਆਂ ਸਾਰੀਆਂ ਵਸਤੂਆਂ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ 10% ਹੈ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਟੈਰਿਫ ਲਗਾਉਣਗੇ, ਔਰ ਇਸ ਨੂੰ ਕੁਝ ਕੁ ਹਾਲਾਤਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇਸ ਦੇ 20% ਤੱਕ ਜਾਣ ਬਾਰੇ ਵੀ ਕਿਹਾ ਗਿਆ। ਪਰ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਕੀ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਦੀ ਆਰਥਿਕਤਾ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਕੀ ਮਾੜੇ ਅਸਰ ਪੈਣਗੇ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਵੀ ਵੇਰਵਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਵੱਡੇ ਪੱਧਰ 'ਤੇ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਜਾ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ। ਯਾਦ ਰਹੇ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਤੇ ਅਮਰੀਕਾ ਦੇ ਦੌਰਾਨ ਤਕਰੀਬਨ ਰੋਜ਼ਾਨਾ ਬਿਲੀਅਨਸ ਆਫ ਡਾਲਰਸ ਦਾ ਆਦਾਨ ਪ੍ਰਦਾਨ ਹੈ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਚੱਲਦਾ ਹੈ, ਔਰ ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਵੱਡੇ ਇਹ ਟ੍ਰੇਡ ਪਾਰਟਨਰ ਨੇ। ਔਰ ਪਰ ਮੌਜੂਦਾ ਸਰਕਾਰ ਦਾ ਇਹ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਕਿ ਉਹ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਨਜਿੱਠਣ ਦੇ ਲਈ ਤਿਆਰ ਨੇ।
Trudeau congratulates Donald Trump on his U.S. presidential win. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has extended congratulations to Donald Trump on his re-election as President of the United States. Trump staged a major political comeback, securing the necessary 270 electoral college votes to win the presidency in the early hours of Wednesday morning. This concludes a turbulent campaign for Trump, which included being convicted of 34 felonies in a hush money case and 2 assassination attempts. On behalf of the Government of Canada, I congratulate Donald Trump on being elected as President of the United States of America for a second term, and Senator J.D. Vance for his election as Vice President of the United States. Trudeau said in a statement, Canada and the U.S. have the world's most successful partnership. We are neighbors and friends united by shared history, common values, and steadfast the ties between our peoples. We are also each other's largest trade partners, and our economies are deeply intertwined. Trudeau added that in Trump's first term, the two nations, along with Mexico, successfully negotiated the Canada-US-Mexico Free Trade Agreement. Trudeau stressed the multi-billion-dollar value of cross-border trade. That trade deal is up for review in 2026, and Trump has promised to introduce a universal 10% tariff on all American imports. Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly also shared her congratulations on the social media platform X. Canada and the U.S. are friends, neighbors, and allies deeply connected through our economies and our people, she wrote. Together, we'll focus on investment, growth, and global peace and security. Canada's ambassador to the U.S., Kristen Hillman, also extended congratulations to Trump and his running mate, J.D. Vance. We have the great fortune of being neighbors, and the U.S. has no closer partner and ally than Canada. Looking forward to working together towards a more prosperous and secure future, she said in a statement. Trudeau added that in Trump's first term, the two nations, along with Mexico, successfully negotiated the Canada-US-Mexico Free Trade Agreement. Trudeau stressed the multi-billion-dollar value of cross-border trade. That trade deal is up for review in 2026, as Trump has promised to introduce to us universal 10% tariff on all American imports.
ਅਮਰੀਕਾ ਦੇ ਰਾਸ਼ਟਰਪਤੀ ਡੋਨਲਡ ਟਰੰਪ ਹੋਰਾਂ ਦੀ ਜਿੱਤ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਦੇ ਪ੍ਰਧਾਨ ਮੰਤਰੀ ਜਸਟਨ ਟਰੂਡੋ ਹੋਰਾਂ ਨੇ ਵਧਾਈ ਦਿੱਤੀ ਔਰ ਨਾਲ ਦੀ ਨਾਲ ਇਹ ਵੀ ਇਸ ਗੱਲ ਦਾ ਵੀ ਜ਼ਿਕਰ ਕੀਤਾ ਕਿ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਤੇ ਅਮਰੀਕਾ ਆਰਥਿਕ ਤੇ ਨਾਲ ਦੀ ਨਾਲ ਭਾਈਚਾਰਕ ਸਾਂਝ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਬੜੇ ਨੇੜੇ ਦੇ ਨੇ ਔਰ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਵੱਡੀ ਪੱਧਰ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਆਪਸ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੀ ਸਾਂਝਾ ਰਿਸ਼ਤਾ ਹੈ ਔਰ ਇਸ ਮੌਕੇ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਅਮਰੀਕਾ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਤੇ ਮੈਕਸੀਕੋ ਦੇ ਤਿੰਨੇ ਮੁਲਕਾਂ ਦਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਫ੍ਰੀ ਟ੍ਰੇਡ ਡੀਲ ਹੈ ਉਸ ਦਾ ਵੀ ਜ਼ਿਕਰ ਕੀਤਾ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕਿ 2026 ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਰੀਨਿਊ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਹੈ ਉਹ ਹੋਣੀ ਹੈ ਔਰ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਮੌਕੇ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਵਿਦੇਸ਼ ਮੰਤਰੀ ਨੇ ਵੀ ਆਪਣੀਆਂ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਵਧਾਈਆਂ ਨੇ ਉਹ ਰਾਸ਼ਟਰਪਤੀ ਤੇ ਉਪ ਰਾਸ਼ਟਰਪਤੀ ਨੂੰ ਦਿੱਤੀਆਂ ਔਰ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਦੇ ਐਮਬੈਸਡਰ ਨੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਅਮਰੀਕਾ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਵੀ ਇਸ ਮੌਕੇ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਰਾਸ਼ਟਰਪਤੀ ਤੇ ਉਪ ਰਾਸ਼ਟਰਪਤੀ ਨੂੰ ਵਧਾਈ ਦਿੱਤੀ है।
इसी के साथ हमें दीजिएगा इजाजत। खबरां दा लेखा जोखा प्रोग्राम से until next time, goodbye and be safe।